This lecture is Blame It on Boston. That's a joke, of course. But it does seem to be true that most of the early resistance to Britain that led to violence happened in Boston. And so if we talk about what is the cause of the American Revolution, the joke is we'll blame it on Boston. Well, why is that? Well, there are a lot of smugglers in Boston, more so than other areas. And smugglers are the hardest hit by any taxes that the British impose. So smugglers are some of the first resistors to British taxation, and they happen to be in Boston. There are also more printing presses in Boston than other areas, and that has a lot to do with sort of Puritan ideas of being educated so you can be a minister, and so they have Harvard, and then there's Yale and Connecticut, and so they establish printing presses so that they can publish Bibles and other religious tracts. But there are the two printing presses in Boston before there are any others in any other colonies. And so the resistance in Boston has a bigger voice, right? They're able to print more than other places, and so a lot of that resistance is centered in Boston. And they are one of the biggest cities that's closest to Canada, and because there are so many French Catholics in Canada, there are more troops in Boston than any other cities, and so the possibility of conflict between colonists and British soldiers is highest in Boston, higher there than anywhere else. Now, after the Boston Massacre, one of the next major events that happened in the colonies that led to the American Revolution was the Tea Act. And here we see an image of the Boston Tea Party. I'm going to talk about that. This happens in 1773. In 1773, there's a major financial panic in Britain, and this puts the British East India Company on the brink of bankruptcy. And if it fails, it could put the British economy into a tailspin. So the British East India Company is one of the major companies in Britain, and it supports the British government with all the taxations, with all the labor and all the products that they have. So it's one of those companies that if it goes bankrupt, if it goes under, the British government could itself go bankrupt. And so the British government decides that they must bail out the British East India Company, similar to what the American government has done for the auto industry a few years back. The idea that you can't not let this company or these manufacturers go under. If they do, it would be so detrimental that the government is willing to bail out this company. So to do this bailout, Britain passes the Tea Act. And this allows the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies without having to go through customs in England. So previously, all companies, they went and say the British East India Company had boats, ships. They would go to the East Indies. So they would go to Indonesia. They would go to places where they could get tea. Then they would sail back to Britain, unload the ships, pay taxes on the tea, load the ships back up, and then go off to America or the Caribbean or wherever else they wanted to sell their tea. And so they paid a tax in Britain. Now the Tea Act allows the ships to go directly from, say, Indonesia straight to Boston. Now this cuts the travel time quite considerably, not in half, but quite considerably. But it also says you don't have to pay this tax because you're not taking the tea into Britain. You don't have to pay the tax on the tea. So this means that the tea is going to be a lot cheaper, and maybe the British East India Company will be able to sell the tea and be able to undercut any smugglers. So maybe the company will do much better. This basically cuts out the middleman and reduces the trips needed and lowers the cost of tea. And it sounds like a good plan, but it effectively puts smugglers out of business by undercutting the cost of tea. Now, most colonists would eagerly buy cheaper tea, even if there's a tea with a little bit of a tax on it, right? They want to pay to drink tea. That this is part of their identity. But colonists, especially smugglers and some merchants, see this as another assault on their liberty and a violation of the British Constitution, and they start to see it as a challenge. So they start holding mass meetings to convince officials to refuse to land the tea in the ports, right? So these ships are coming from the British East India Company. And the colonists say, we don't want this tea to land, right? Because if it lands, then we have to pay taxes on it and people will drink it. So we want to prevent it from coming on shore. And the tea is turned back, and in New York and in Philadelphia, in Charleston, it's unloaded, but then the tea is destroyed. In Boston, Governor Hutchinson insists that he has to allow the tea to port, right? And two of Governor Hutchinson's sons are the tea agents, the ones who are collecting the tax on the tea. So the first ship arrives in Boston November 28, 1773. And Bostonians hold a special meeting to convince Hutchinson to send the tea back to England, and Hutchinson absolutely refuses. So on December 16, 1773, a group of 60 Sons of Liberty, these are the name of the people who resist, dress up as quote-unquote Mohawks. That's Native Americans. They call them Mohawks. This is the closest Native American tribe that Massachusetts are familiar with. So 60 Sons of Liberty dressed up as Mohawks appeared, marched to the docks, and they carefully dumped 10,000 pounds of tea into the harbor. That's 342 chests. Now, you can see an image here where they are portrayed as Native Americans. But why did they dress up as Native Americans? What purpose does it serve, right? Why not just protest or not drink tea? Why is it necessary to dress up as Native Americans and jump the tea overboard? Well, the idea is it's a sort of a code switch, right? If you dressed up as yourself, right, you would be dumping tea. But if you dressed up as a Native American, well, it's not you who's dumping tea, it's these Native Americans who are dumping tea. And, the Bostonians perceive Native Americans as uncivilized and savage, and they would do that. But, the ruly Bostonians, they wouldn't do that. It's the same way that happens at Halloween, right? People dress up, and they do things that they may not otherwise do because it's Halloween, because they are dressed up. Some people say, well, maybe it was a part of a disguise. I don't think that the disguise was so much so that they would have been unrecognizable. In fact, most of the accounts from the time shows that they were very much recognizable. People knew exactly who it was who was dumping the tea overboard. This absolutely infuriates Britain. This is an act of resistance that's just too much for the British government to bear. How dare the colonists destroy that much tea, that much sort of sign of Britishness? They dump it overboard. And by the way, if you ever go to Boston, you can go to one of the museums there, and you can actually throw tea overboard. It's kind of fun. They actually don't throw it into the harbor, but you can reenact that. So, in response, Britain at the beginning of 1774 passes 4 laws. So Britain passes 4 laws at the beginning of 1774. They're collectively known as the Coercive Acts, and they're intended to punish Boston and Massachusetts for, quote, dangerous commotions and insurrections. And the 4 acts include the Boston Port Bill. The Boston Port Bill closes Boston to all shipping until the destroyed tea is paid for, right? Which is a little bit problematic, right? How are you going to pay for the tea if there's no products or coming in or going out, right? How are you going to get the revenue to pay for that? But they close the Port Bill until it's a punishment. The second bill is the Massachusetts Government Act, and this changes the colony's charter, establishes stronger royal control, and limits town meetings to once a year, right? So this is a curtailment of local government control, right? This makes Massachusetts incredibly mad. The third act is the Administration of Justice Acts, which allows the British government to move any trials to Great Britain or another colony if the officials believe that local juries are biased, right? So if there's someone who's arrested, they say there's no way that this person's going to be convicted because the jury is all Bostonians and they're in favor of the person on trial. They can move that trial to Great Britain at any point. And the fourth act is the New Quartering Act, which strengthens the old Quartering Act by saying that all soldiers have to be housed closer to where they are stationed, right? Putting an additional burden on Bostonians. There's a fifth act that is not actually part of the Coercive Acts, but is passed around the same time. And people see it as part of the Coercive Acts that says that there's going to be a colony in Quebec and that Catholics can swear oaths of allegiance, right? It basically gives a colony close to Massachusetts filled with Catholics. And Massachusetts especially hates that. They're very anti-Catholic, and they have been for a very, very long time, until the Irish migration changed the demographics of Boston. So these 4 acts, and 5 acts if you're from Boston, are seen as intended to punish and isolate Massachusetts, and especially Boston. And Boston begins to be seen as the center of colonial resistance. Now, here is an image, it's called The Able Doctor, And again, this is an etching by Paul Revere. If you take a look at it, I'll explain a little bit. It's called The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Drought. And so that means the draught here is the drink. And so if you look at it, America is the woman in the middle. And she's portrayed as a Native American. So there's this sort of perception of America's identity is tied to sort of this sort of more Native perspective, and a woman, right? So it's very much someone in a subordinate position, but someone who can fight back very strongly. And you have these men surrounding her, and you have Lord North, who's pouring the tea down her throat. There are other politicians, Lord Mansfield and Lord Sandwich, are holding America down. Looking on are Britannia, France, and Spain. So you have military law standing over them. You have France and Spain just sort of gawking and not doing anything. And there's Britannia or Columbia, the sort of female sign of sort of America, British liberty, holding her face in shame and sorrow. So what does this do? Well, this portrays a sort of very anti-British. This is almost, here's Lord Sandwich is literally looking up the woman's dress, right? This is akin to a sexual assault. And this is sort of, they're looking at Britain and saying, you are assaulting us, right? It's an akin to a rape, is how they see this, right? This is a forcible, violent, sexual attack on America. Here are two more images from America in response to the Coercive Act. On the right, you have America as represented as a sort of venerable lady surrounded by flames, right? So you have again that sort of victimless, America as a victim of the British. Here she is being burned. You have Lord Bute on the left. Lord Mansfield is center. And they ply bellows, right, to make the fires go hotter. And those are the coercive acts, the Quaker Bill and then the Massachusetts Bay Act. And then you have the devil looking on the right. You have Lord North holding a copy of the Boston Port Bill, who looks at her sort of haughtily. Beneath her, there are four patriots trying to extinguish the flames with bucket and syringes, and a spilled teapot is at America's feet, symbolizing the Boston Tea Party, the impetus for the Coercive Acts. And this is sort of American flames with the British ministry exacerbating it, and patriots coming to the rescue. On the left, we don't know who drew this, but you see Bostonians caged by their own Liberty Tree, guarded by cannons, and fed by sort of Salem fishermen. And if you look at this is not a positive portrayal of Bostonians and colonists. So unlike the first two, this one's almost certainly done by a British artist, sort of portraying the sort of like, oh, Americans, they're caught, they are basically hungry because of their own fault, right? Their liberty has made them caged, right? It's a little bit of an irony in there. So to take you back a little bit, and if you've heard this again before, I apologize. In 1771, Samuel Adams decided to create a committee of correspondence. And this is committees that are non-legal that each town would set up so that they could communicate with each other. So Massachusetts quickly sets up one in each town. Other colonies quickly follows them. And these are in place when Boston resists the Tea Act. And when Boston is faced with the coercive acts, each of these committees of correspondence quickly rally to Boston's aid. Now, the Boston Committee of Correspondence drafts what we call the Solemn League and Covenant, and it calls for non-consumption of British goods effective August 1st, 1774. Right? So This is easy to keep in Boston. Their port is closed. But the idea is that they're going to ask the sort of covenant. They're going to ask through this league and covenant that other towns in Massachusetts and other towns throughout the colonies don't consume British goods. They don't import British goods, and they don't consume British goods. And quickly, the other towns, their committees of correspondence get together, and they pledge to support this covenant, that they will not consume British goods. Now, the committees of correspondence in other colonies send food and money to Boston in the summer and fall of 1774 to help. And in fact, the House of Burgesses, that's the Virginia Congress in May 1774, which is now meeting in a Williamsburg tavern, declares that an attack made on one of our sister colonies to compel submission to arbitrary taxes is an attack on all of British America and threatens the ruin of all. And so they start calling for an intercolonial Congress. So here's the First Continental Congress, and it meets September 5th, 1774 in Philadelphia. And this is Carpenter's Hall where they meet. And this First Continental Congress is explicitly called in reaction to the course of acts. They're there to discuss Boston's need. There are 55 delegates representing 12 colonies. Georgia doesn't get there because they're having problems with their Native American population, and they really need to keep on the good side of British soldiers who are helping them out. So these 55 delegates, they travel to Philadelphia for the Congress. They are the leading political figures of their each respective colonies, and they are confident that they enjoy sort of broad electoral support. So each colony gets a single vote in this First Continental Congress. Most of the men are lawyers, they're merchants, they're planters, and they've been active in opposing Britain over the last decade. These are men who have been the leaders of resistance. So they really sort of represent the elite leaders. So the American Revolution at this point is they're still relying on their leaders, right? This is not a revolution where they're like, oh yeah, now it's democratic and everyone gets a vote and we're all equal. Not yet. So this First Continental Congress has 3 tasks. First, they have to figure out what are America's grievances, right? What are the problems that they have? Then they have to redefine their relationship with Britain, and then they have to figure out a way of finding a solution to this. So they quickly find a list of acts that they want repealed, right? This is especially the course of acts. They have a much harder time redefining the relationship between Britain and the colonies because they all have different views, right? Some of them have very good relations with Britain, but just want some slight changes. Some have very radical views, right, where they want to get rid of all the relationships with Britain. Some say, okay, well, we don't like the king, but we do like Parliament. Some say, well, we should acknowledge Parliament, but not on trade. And so, in general, what we have is those that are more radical are those in the Northeast. So Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, which support Massachusetts. The middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Virginia, they're sort of on the fence. But what they do is they write a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, and this is October 1774, where they ask the king to intercede to protect American liberty and remove the coercive acts. On top of that, just a week later, October 20, 1774, they create what we call the Continental Association, which is that each of the colonies will agree to non-importation and non-exportation, right? No importing of consumer goods and eventually no exporting American goods to Britain. It's basically a total boycott starting in December of 1774 unless the coercive acts are repealed, right? This is not a requirement. It's a recommendation to each of the colonies, but they hope that the American people go along with it. If it doesn't work, right? If non-importation, non-exportation, if this boycott doesn't work to end the coercive acts, then the Continental Congress will reconvene in May 1775. At that point, there will be the Second Continental Congress. So the First Continental Congress just does the response to the coercive acts and does this Continental Association, which says we will boycott Britain. But if it doesn't work, the Second Continental Congress will reconvene in May 1775 to figure out what is going on. Now, at that point, in 1774, the British colonies are still reacting to the British Parliament. They're not calling the shots. But now, they're starting to go on the offensive, right? They start to, along with the boycott, they start to train. Right? So militias start to train, and there are special units called Minutemen who are organized to respond to emergencies. So they call for volunteer companies to be ready at a minute's warning with a fortnight's provision and ammunition and arms. And this becomes the basis for the Continental Army. And the Minutemen start by emptying warehouses, British warehouses of ammunition. So there's a lot of British soldiers, and they have a lot of weapons. And so these Minutemen start raiding British warehouses and stealing the guns and gunpowder and cannons and any ammunition they can and stockpiling it in other places. Now, it takes Britain a while to learn of America's hatred of the Corsovaks, but when they learn about the Continental Congress and the smuggling of ammunitions, they start to order British soldiers to march into the countryside and seize any of the supplies that have been stolen. So on April 14th, 1774, British soldiers are ordered to capture some opposition leaders, people like Samuel Adams, John Adams, and seize and destroy military supplies. So on April 18th, British troops secretly march into the interior of Massachusetts. They set out across the Back Bay in small boats, then cross the river into Lexington, then Concord, to arrive in the morning of April 19th. Now, Joseph Warren sees the small boats in the Back Bay, and he warns Paul Revere to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who are hiding in Lexington, that the British are coming. Now, Paul Revere sets up a lantern in the North Church in Charleston, and that would be one lamp if the British move over the neck, two if they go by water. Soon, all the civilians in the surrounding areas know that the British are on the move, so it's not secret at all. So the British hope to keep this secret, but it's not secret at all. Now, colonists are warned by gunshots by the colonists as the British pass through. But Paul Revere and a man named William Dawes both ride their horses to Lexington to warn Hancock and Adams, and then they ride on to Concord. Now, Revere never made it. He was captured, but William Dawes made it, and he got through. So the sort of, I know you have to think about that for your paragraph response. Now, the British arrive in Concord at approximately 4:30 a.m. To an awake and ready militia, although they're slightly disorganized. And they find about 70 Minutemen in Lexington. They ask them to stand down, then a fire is shot, and it's unclear who fires the first shot. The British troops fire and kill 8 colonists, mostly in the back, right? The colonists basically turn tail and run. And of course, the British soldiers have been frustrated and harassed and bored for months, and so they're kind of difficult to control. The British, one private is grazed in the leg. So after approximately half an hour, the revolution has begun. Then the British continue on to Concord, where they destroy 500 pounds of musket balls, 60 barrels of flour, and they stay until noon destroying property. Now, the Concord militia go to protect their town. There are some shootings. Americans lose 2, 1 wounded, British 3 killed, 9 wounded. Everything is confusion. Then the British go back to Boston. When they leave Lexington and Concord, they're assaulted by thousands of militiamen, Minutemen, on the road back to Boston. It's like they're going along a road, and on both sides, there are colonists firing down on them, right? The fighting is so intense that Gage, who's in charge of the British, sends a relief column to ask for a relief column from Boston to rescue the expedition. In total, they lose 73 men, with over 200 wounded or missing, while the colonists lose 49 men, with 39 wounded or missing. So the word of Lexington and Concord quickly spreads through the colonies, and riders ride very hard to carry the news to other colonies. And so other colonists send troops to Boston, and there's a siege on Boston, on the British who are in Boston. So the Corsovaks and a boycott is one thing, but this is clearly an aggressive war. So May 1775, just 2 weeks after Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress meets, and they now have to decide what to do.